this, get that started. Okay.
Okay. And thank you so much for allowing me to join you today for this webinar. Can everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Okay, great. So before I get started, I just want to give a little bit of background of kind of how this topic came to be a topic of interest to me. So before starting at Fayetteville State University, where I currently teach, I was working at a small private college that wanted to expand their business program. And in doing so, they enlisted a vendor that encouraged them to consider prior learning. They needed to learn more about prior learning assessment, so they funded my training, and me being always a lifelong learner, I earned a prior learning assessor certification from DePaul University and the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. And so that information is going to be the basis for the content that I'll be sharing with you today. Through the course of our session today, we're going to define what PLA is. We're going to discuss some of the benefits of it, some common concerns. We're also going to detail the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, CAEL's 10 principles for prior learning assessment. We'll discuss the case for PLA at Barton College, and I also should amend that because I ran some numbers for Fayetteville State, so if we have time, we'll explore what PLA could mean to Fayetteville State as well. We'll discuss some financial and logistical considerations, and also spend a bit of time discussing the climate for PLA since the COVID-19 pandemic. So prior learning assessment is a process through which a student's educational, training, and professional experiences are evaluated by faculty to determine whether those experiences are credit-worthy. And that determination is based on evidence and competency demonstration that they have attained the desired student learning outcomes for the courses for which they seek to be granted credit. Now, there are some types of PLA that are already in widespread use throughout higher ed. So for instance, CLEP exams, the college level examination programs, where a student can take a test, and if they pass the test, they get the course credit for that topic. Or challenge exams, where a student might take a comprehensive final exam for a course. If they pass the challenge exam, they get the course credit. We have so many universities that issue course credits for military training, and will also allow language fluency exemptions for students that are multilingual. And one example of PLA that we'll focus on a bit for this session is the portfolio evaluation process, where a student would develop a portfolio that markets the experiences that they've had prior to their enrollment or outside of school, and aligns those experiences, those competencies, those skill sets to the learning outcomes for university courses. And so really quickly, based on the examples that I've shared of PLA, the CLEP exams, challenge exams, military credits, language fluency exemptions, and portfolio evaluation, if you could, by a virtual show of hands, just indicate how many of your universities offer at least one of the types of PLA listed here. Now, to do a virtual show of hands, if you want to click on that drop-down menu from the top of your screen, go to participants, and you can just click actually yes or no in that participants window. So your screen might look a little something like this. You can click yes or no. So does your university offer at least one of these types? Okay. Oh, wow. All right. So we've got about more and more yeses. 2, 3, 4, about 7 yeses. Okay. Thank you for that input. So as you can see, PLA is already widespread. So we will continue further. I've mentioned so far what PLA is, but I also wanted to provide some clarity on what PLA is not. All right, so PLA, when done properly and in a manner that is compliant with the accrediting bodies, is not what some assume it to be. So I remember years ago watching TV late at night and seeing these commercials, usually from for-profit schools back in the day, that would promise things like 30 credits for life experience. That's not what PLA is. It's not automatic like that. It does require specific evidence-based, data-driven analysis of those prior experiences and the demonstrated competencies associated with those, and maps those to the student learning outcomes for the university courses. There are several benefits to prior learning assessment. So one is that it can increase enrollment. So it attracts non-traditional students to schools that offer this PLA. And it does so in a couple of ways. It increases the number of credits that that university will recognize for that incoming student, which in many cases is a decision factor when they're choosing which university they want to attend. PLA can also help to necessitate an increased faculty headcount because it does require that faculty or subject matter experts in the discipline review the portfolios to determine whether a student's prior experiences are in fact creditworthy. It generates additional revenue. So CALE recommends that colleges and universities charge some fee for the assessment of these portfolios. That can be in the form of just a standard fee outside of tuition that students pay to have the service of a faculty member reviewing their portfolio process and consulting with them and evaluating that portfolio for creditworthiness. Or what many universities will do is that they will offer an actual course, whether that course is 1 or 2 or 3 credits. And in that portfolio development course, the student would be guided by an instructor on how to identify possible creditworthy experiences that they've had and to encompass that in a portfolio for submission and routing to the necessary decision makers. And so I often liken that portfolio development process as an opportunity for universities to standardize what these portfolios look like. So the university might say, these are 5 things that a portfolio must contain, and these are some other types of evidence that we will suggest that students include. And sometimes that may vary by discipline. So if you think about writing your dissertation, when each university will have their own style guide. For the portfolio process, universities that offer a portfolio development course will often have their own style guide that a student must adhere to, just to make sure that these materials are received in a consistent format. PLA is definitely a growing trend among both traditional and for-profit colleges and universities. So we've got big schools like Ohio University, Purdue, Penn State offering PLA, including that portfolio development piece. But we also have smaller schools like Middle Georgia State and Middle Tennessee State. And lastly, precedent has already been set for PLA in a few ways, definitely by the CLEP and challenge exams, but also by many universities transitioning to a co-curricular degree requirement. And by doing so, they're saying that, okay, you can attend school, but this degree won't be granted solely based on your course performance. You are required to obtain and demonstrate these experiences outside of the classroom. And many universities will actually already have a course on their books, oftentimes labeled as a co-op experience course, which might be in some places worth 3 credits up to as many as 15 credits based on a student working full-time and being able to relate that work experience to their degree pursuit. Now, there are some concerns about PLA. And initially, when I was tasked with learning more about it, I was a little skeptical too. But as I learned more, I realized that the value and the guidelines and regulations surrounding PLA really serve to kind of negate some of the concerns. But nonetheless, some concerns about PLA will include instructor credential, at least for the accrediting bodies, serving as an indicator of instructional quality. So for instance, if there's a student that spent a few years working at an accounting firm and wants to submit that experience as part of their portfolio for assessment, we don't know the credentials of whoever taught them their job at the accounting firm to know if that person would be deemed academically or professionally qualified by SACS or AACSB or any other accrediting body. However, with the portfolio process and the portfolio evaluation process, the assessment of the portfolios and the verification that the learning outcomes are met are things that are achieved by an internal decision maker that is academically and professionally qualified according to the accrediting bodies. Secondly, there can be some concerns about accreditation compliance with PLA and this portfolio piece. But with SACs, PLA is permissible, including that portfolio piece, is permissible as a substantive change. So institutions that seek to implement this sort of prior learning will need to first get approval from SACs and then implement. And one really interesting thing that I found out in my recent research was that for the AACSB, according to their 2020 standards, competency-based education credit is inclusive of prior learning. And so they're opening up the door for this portfolio assessment process. And lastly, one concern about PLA may be a lack of faculty reviewed deliverables. So the student isn't completing the assignments as they are detailed in a class. However, that portfolio development course option does help to teach the student how to demonstrate their competencies in a manner that is aligned with the student learning outcomes and the standard assignments in many of these classes. So now we'll go into what some of the CALE PLA quality standards are. So first, the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning requires that course credit be awarded based on evidence of learning. That evidence will be content that demonstrates that the student learning outcomes are met, that the competencies are held by that student. Credit for prior learning should not be awarded based on experience, so how much time a person was in a job, or how much time they spent in training on the topic. Because as we know, based on some of our classes, a student might be in class for 30, 70, 100 hours and might not be fully paying attention, etc. So the competencies have to be demonstrated as part of that evidence. Assessment, even if a student does or does not get all of the credit they're requesting, the assessment process is still integral to learning because it helps the student to identify any gaps between the experience they have and that which they need to successfully pass one of the courses and complete their degree. And it allows them to tailor their future learning opportunities to fill in any gaps. Even the feedback process is helpful to students because it helps to guide their future learning. Assessment should be based on the student learning outcomes that are shared throughout the university and clearly articulated in the course catalogs and the syllabi for the courses for which a student is seeking credit. Determinations of creditworthiness should be made only by the appropriate subject matter and credentialing experts, generally faculty members in the discipline. Assessment also serves a social equity purpose, right? So it helps to enhance access to education and equity in education for diverse individuals from diverse backgrounds and helps to support their success so that the credit-worthy experiences that they have working full-time or being involved in different community organizations or just learning that they've done on their own but that fulfill the student learning outcomes of a course are recognized. According to CALE, the institutions should provide proactive guidance for the learner, even throughout the assessment process. So we want to make sure we're not leaving students on their own to navigate this maze of building the business case for their experiences to be deemed creditworthy. It's important that either a faculty member or a staff member, whoever is going to be tasked with this at the university, be involved with the student in that assessment, in that portfolio development piece, so that if the student starts off on the wrong path, they're just on the wrong path with their portfolio development, there's somebody there to let them know, hey, before you go 10 miles down the wrong road, let me redirect you to make sure that your portfolio encompasses all of the things needed for consideration of this request. The assessment policies and procedures related to PLA should be made in a group decision-making fashion. So they need to be discussed and deliberated upon by stakeholders university-wide. So for example, if at my university they decided to do PLA in the College of Business, business students aren't necessarily only going to request PLA credit for business classes. They might want PLA credit for a gym course, a physical education course, or for a health course, or for an English course. And so it's going to be necessary to engage stakeholders in the different schools, the different academic disciplines that are familiar with the PLA processes and standards. And so those standards, those policies, those procedures need to be agreed upon by all of the academic units. So since PLA is a revenue generator for institutions, it's important that the fees charged be based on the services performed, just the service of consulting with the student as they're developing their portfolio and reviewing their portfolio, instead of having those fees charged based on the credits awarded, because this PLA is an opportunity for students to add some efficiency to their matriculation, but also some cost efficiency to their college expenses. And so the fees charged should be flat, a flat fee as much as possible based on the services performed as they are developing their portfolio and as it's being reviewed. Stakeholders that are involved in PLA, so we talked about how it will require stakeholders from the different academic disciplines, but those stakeholders need to be trained and receive continuing professional development on the PLA process and the functions that they perform. And this is because CALE also recommends that these assessment programs be monitored regularly and evaluated, and when necessary, even be revised to respond to the needs of the learner, the institution, and to make sure that the program is optimized. So a few interesting facts about students who receive PLA credits. So PLA students are 2.5 times more likely to earn a graduate degree than students without PLA credit. On average, by going through this prior learning assessment process, on average, students earn about 18 credits, but they also wind up taking about 10 more credits than their peers that don't get PLA credit. And so for students that receive PLA, they wind up netting about 8 fewer undergraduate credits, or about half of a semester, in comparison to their peers that do not have any PLA credit. All right, so now I'm going to move forward a bit to quantify the impact of PLA. So because PLA students have an average graduation rate of about 88%, the impact of PLA can be quantified by measuring the revenue gained or retained, depending on how you want to look at it, by reducing attrition through that PLA implementation. So the Educational Policy Institute a few years ago put forth a paper where it analyzed almost 1,700 US universities to determine what the cost was that was associated with attrition from four-year colleges and universities. And in calculating that, they determined that the annual projected attrition loss was actually a function of the student population times the attrition rate times tuition divided by 2. And so using that formula, when I was at my previous college, I used that to calculate what the fiscal impact would be if PLA were implemented, including that portfolio process at Barton College at the time. So a little description about Barton. Barton is a very tiny private college in rural eastern North Carolina. It has about 1,000 students. So Barton was about a little smaller than my high school. Nonetheless, they had at the time about a 6-year graduation rate of about 53%. And when we calculate the attrition rate with the lifetime value, that tuition revenue that they could be getting, they were having an attrition loss of about almost $7.3 million. Whereas if, and I had some estimates in here, so if PLA were implemented at Barton, and if only half of students earned PLA credit at just the average rate, 18 credits of PLA credit, that increased retention, because with PLA students graduating at a graduation rate of 88%, that increased retention would raise the average graduation rate for the university to 71%, which would result in a decreased attrition loss of $4.3 million, which would mean that Barton would stand to gain or retain almost $3 million through implementing PLA. Now, of course, that would be about $500,000 each annually over 6 years. And it'll be important to note that this is based on tuition revenue for their 2018-19 year. It does not include any revenue received for housing, food, or revenue from new enrollees. It doesn't factor in the number of students that might be on academic scholarship from the university. And it does reflect the fact that PLA earners wind up completing net 8 fewer undergraduate courses, and that they have an average graduation rate of 88%. All right, so in preparation for this presentation and just for kicks, I said, let me pull some numbers and see what this would look like if my current institution at Fayetteville State were to explore this. So I pulled some data from Fayetteville State's fee sheets, their fact sheets, and iPads. And according to the numbers, with a few assumptions, right? So we don't yet have fall 2020 data, or in terms of enrollment. But with Fayetteville State having about 6,551 students, if PLA is not offered, if we look at the graduation and attrition rates at our current tuition rate, the university could be missing out on about $15 million in revenue. If PLA were implemented and only half of students got PLA credit at the average amount, 18 credits per student that receives PLA credit, that attrition loss could be decreased to about 6.8 million. Now, again, this does not reflect students receiving university scholarships. It also does not reflect the tuition differential for out-of-state students, which for Fayetteville State is negligible because we only have about 6% out-of-state students. So a projected estimated fiscal impact would be about $8.5 million in revenue gained or retained at the university, about $1.5 million annually over 6 years. And so this is based on a couple of assumptions, right? So assuming that the 2020 enrollment numbers are the same as the 2019, it also excludes any non-tuition revenues. It doesn't include housing, food. It also doesn't include future enrollees. But with PLA earners having an average graduation rate of 88%, that would increase the average graduation rate of the university. If half of the students earn PLA credit, it would increase the average graduation rate of the university to about 62%. And so that's where we're seeing kind of that retention, that longer term retention. It'll also be important to keep in mind that these figures do not even consider any possible increase in enrollment based on marketing of a PLA program. So we're just looking at the numbers of students that we have currently. So I've given a lot of kind of background data and a couple of cases, but oftentimes the next question is, well, how is this done? If a university wanted to implement a PLA program, how would it be done? And what I'm sharing with you now is basically the same information that I shared at Barton when we were implementing the PLA program there, and that it can be definitely a phased approach. So phase one would be all about communication and communication management. So making the university aware that not that anything's guaranteed or approved, but just that this is in the pipeline, right? Just educating faculty, staff, and students on what PLA is and what possibilities for PLA may be considered. For universities that choose to, they can develop a PLA course during phase one, establish a PLA committee that is multidisciplinary with representatives from each academic unit, and they can also look at improving course or credit transferability. So one thing that I did was with Barton, I looked at what courses do students transfer in frequently from the community colleges, and which of those aren't being accepted as equivalent and why. So to give a little bit of background, we had at Barton a Principles of Management course, which at many other places is a 200 level course, but I've seen in North Carolina it's often a 300 level course. Because the same course, Principles of Management, is numbered as a 100 level at community colleges, it's often accepted as a transfer credit, but as an elective, meaning that students still will need to retake Principles of Management at the four-year school. And so I took a look at that, pulled syllabi from community colleges, I reviewed the textbooks, and even looked at who the professor was. And what I found was that Barton had this same professor that we would sometimes use as an adjunct that also taught at the community college. So it's the same content from the same professor, but it wasn't being accepted as equivalent. And in expanding this review to cover all of the courses in the North Carolina Articulation Agreement to see where we might not be appropriately deeming courses equivalent, I found about 35 courses that weren't being transferred in as equivalent. I'm sorry, 27 courses, which increased the number of courses being accepted by 35%. So that's phase one. Phase two, universities can develop a list of course equivalent certifications. So one thing that CALE encourages and that AACSB allows is micro-credentialing. So for instance, if a student's coming in and they already have Microsoft Office specialist certifications in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and maybe an A+ certification, do they really need to take Information Systems 141 or MIS 201? Maybe not. We might be able to consider those prior experiences, those prior credentials as equivalent. Universities can also either establish or enhance their campus testing centers to offer more industry recognized certification exams like CLEP, like Microsoft Office Specialist. And there could even be some possibilities of partnering with a for-profit testing center company like Prometric to maybe have a satellite location on the university's campus. Phase two is a good time to get a trustee vote, because if the university's bylaws do not mention prior learning assessment, we want to make sure that it's approved at the university level before continuing on. And phase two is also a good time to identify any additional assessors of prior learning at the university. And then with phase three, once things get that trustee vote, phase three would be a good time to reach out to SACS or AACSB or ACBSP, whichever your accrediting body is, and complete the required substantive change documentation, get that approved. And then market the program, not just on the website and print materials and on social media, but also in the application process. Most students are submitting their resume with their application anyway, so it might be helpful to vet those resumes and maybe flag students that may be eligible, or students that may want to consider submitting a portfolio for course credit. And of course, with phase three, the implementation of a portfolio development course can be done at that point. And that course should probably be offered at least once annually. But of course, with prior learning assessment, it's going to vary from school to school. So there's not one standardized way that it's done all across the board. But CALE does make certain recommendations about this. One thing that I want to add that I hadn't mentioned previously, with the portfolio review process, CALE also recommends that these portfolios be anonymized so that there be no identifying information, just like a blind peer review when we're submitting our articles to these journals, so that the reviewer is looking at just the portfolio, just the evidence, not the student's name or anything else, to make sure that any possibility of bias is minimized or eliminated. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so this probably sounds like a lot of work, which it is, but it can be helpful to flag or have some process for early notification of students or applicants that might be good candidates for PLA. But at many schools, the registrar might not have very much bandwidth to take on this additional task, especially at peak times like registration times, during the drop add periods, or at the end of a semester around graduation time. Also, advisors, depending on how many students they're tasked with advising, they might have limited bandwidth to perform this function. So who's going to do it? And that's where the meta-analysts come to save the day, right? So meta-analyst is actually a job description that I composed at a previous institution, would be military, experiential, and transfer application analysts. So these would be the individuals that will review and research the incoming transcripts or the transcripts of incoming students to determine whether they have prior experiences or courses that may be worth further investigation for creditworthiness, whether these are students that you would encourage to enroll in this PLA course or pursue this PLA process, this portfolio process. With the military experience, I have noticed that with military training in particular, the course names are generally very different than anything we'll see at a university. But sometimes on digging a little deeper, the course content, the learning outcomes, and the skills that the courses develop might actually map to some courses that are offered at the university level. But with that, it might take more time in research and analysis than the average registrar's office or advisement office may have time to do. Some other considerations might be a testing lab or enhancing the capabilities of the testing lab by offering exams in more industry recognized certifications. And lastly, a workflow management platform through which students, as they reach the conclusion of their portfolio development course, can submit their portfolios, and it will automatically route to the PLA assessor, that faculty member in the necessary academic disciplines in which the student is pursuing course credit. A workflow management platform will also track that review process and route the necessary alerts when the portfolio reaches the different reviewers and their decisions. So a student might do one portfolio through which they're seeking credit for 2 business classes and 3 gen ed courses, and it will disperse the information to the necessary reviewers. All right, so COVID considerations. We are living in a very interesting time. But the change that we're experiencing with the COVID pandemic can be an opportunity in many ways. It creates an improved climate for non-traditional methods of instruction and assessment. We literally had to flip the switch from face-to-face training to online training nationwide at all levels of education. In doing so, it has dissipated the level of scrutiny that some individuals may have towards non-traditional education methods. And universities right now, in order to be prepared for whether or not we need to continue in this online instructional manner long term, universities are investing in more learning technologies. Another consideration is that PLA, including the portfolio assessment process, can potentially offset the loss of students due to COVID. So with so many job closures, furloughs, layoffs, et cetera, there might be students that just no longer have the financial means to continue their education. But so we might be losing some enrollment based on just COVID-related attrition. But by implementing and effectively marketing PLA programs, we might be able to offset that loss by gaining new students just based on the opportunities that we're presenting for their prior experiences to be considered for credit. It could also serve to help with the retention of faculty that may be high risk. So with schools still trying to make the decision of how to reopen and what face-to-face instruction looks like, for faculty members that are high risk, there may be some apprehension about going back into a classroom with 30 or 40 or an auditorium full of students breathing in your direction. But if PLA is offered in this way, then faculty may choose to avoid the classroom and instead exercise an opportunity to continue working remotely through the review of these portfolios in their respective discipline. And with all of these things, the COVID pandemic, possibilities of attrition, the need to retain high risk and also high quality faculty, it creates a willingness among both state and private universities to consider, and even possibly in some cases fast track, a pilot to explore the viability of this at respective institutions. So for example, within the UNC system, at the system-wide level, there is an adult learning network of about 6 universities that have high ratios of non-traditional students. And we meet periodically to discuss how to best serve these students. And PLA is one of the avenues by which we seek to better serve this student population. And so now I'm going to ask a quick question. So I've shared a bunch of information. And based on the information shared so far, and by using a virtual show of hands, how many people feel as though their university could benefit from either enhanced PLA offerings or the exploration of a portfolio process? So I'm going to ask that you click on that drop-down toolbar from your screen and then just indicate a quick yes or no. Okay, thanks, Paul. Hey, Mr. McElveen, good to see you. Oscar, hey, thank you for the input. Let's see if I can, wow, we're getting a lot of, okay, that's promising. Yeah, it can be handy and just worth exploring. And if the higher ups decide no, that's okay too, but that'll be a well-informed decision on whether it's a good fit for your institution. All right, so I'm seeing about 5 hands. Thank you so much for your participation. 7, okay, great, fantastic. All right, well, thank you all so much for your participation. And before I conclude, I want to take a moment to just see, does anybody have any questions?
I'll jump on first. Really enjoyed that. Thanks for the presentation. And you did take me back to earlier in my career when me and my coworkers, everyone has to get their master's degree in active duty military. And I know a lot of the discussion always centered around what school could we get the most credits from our military training. And that would have been one of the primary drivers of what school a lot of my colleagues chose based on that PLA. I just didn't know it was a thing, but now I know a whole lot more about it. But you did ask at the end about our institutions, if they should do PLA. And I know at the Air Force Academy, they don't accept credits from anywhere. And
Oh, okay.
they even have cadets who have served active duty as enlisted for up to 5 years, and then they go there to be cadets, and they start from the bottom. But they do not
Wow.
accept any of their prior Air Force experience to move them along, because you got to go through the full 4 classes. But it's definitely an interesting concept, and something I'll bring up to the bosses back there to see if it's time to look at that again. And it might bring more prior service cadets to the academy if they knew their prior training would be accepted and give them some kind of perks and going through. So, but thanks for sharing. That was really.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for that feedback. And you got really great points about military credits sometimes not being accepted to the same degree as standard transfer credits.
Mhm.
At my current institution, we have dedicated academic advisors, but at my prior school, faculty members served as the advisors. And I remember having a student that was a military veteran. He'd served for many years, and he felt that some of his credits didn't transfer in the way he'd anticipated. And although there is a list of military courses that map in pretty neatly, he had additional training. And I actually worked with him and had him send me some of his certificates and his manuals, some of which might have been kind of classified, but his manuals for these courses, so I could see exactly what was studied, what were the learning outcomes, what were the objectives of the class. And after that, I saw that he had some additional martial arts training that counted as phys ed. He had a few additional courses, including one on strategic decision making in the military, which was actually, it mapped very neatly to an advanced decision making course in the School of Business. So by that added review and research of his prior experiences and credentials, he was able to get 10 more credits than he'd initially been granted on that initial review of his information by, I guess, the registrar's office or admissions. But thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem. Thank you.
No problem. And are there any other questions?
Hi,
Hi,
Tyechia. Is it okay if I go, Tyechia?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was a lot of work, and I'm so impressed with all the thought you put into this. I was thinking about strategies. If an administrator had to prioritize, you said that at Fayetteville you only have 6% of the population from out of state, or that are not local.
Yeah.
Versus the PLA. So in this time of COVID, I think this is a very good strategy to pursue this opportunity locally. That's a comment I would give, right? So so for those students who decide during this, in the COVID era, that they want to be closer to home, it's a really great idea for them to really put some thought into this PLA opportunity. And the other thing I was considering, why is it only 6%? This is not really PLA, but if you had to prioritize, if you had limited resources and had to prioritize, and given that it's so difficult accepting credits from elsewhere, why wouldn't they put the effort into recruiting from outside of their local area? And then 3, I'm part of a university system here in New York City where we're one university with 25 campuses, and yet we don't accept credits from each other. So that's I find all of that very interesting.
Okay. Thank you for your commentary and your questions. And I'm going to hope I don't miss anything with responding to these questions. So with Fayetteville State, we just have a population of students that like being near home. I can't speak to whether or the degree to which admissions recruits from out of state. What I will say is that according to Kale, the design for a PLA program should offer equal accessibility. So we want to make sure not to breach regulation or anything by offering CALE only to in-state or only to out-of-state students, because especially with the portfolio process, even if there's an articulation agreement between my university and the community colleges in my state, the portfolio process would allow students that have received or taken prior courses at community colleges in different states to advocate for those classes being considered credit worthy in North Carolina. So Fayetteville State having a 6% population of students from other states is, I can't say that it would be for a lack of recruiting from those states, but we're a small school in North Carolina. We're not in really one of the jazzy cities like Raleigh or Charlotte or Greensboro in the middle. And I imagine that for students that are coming from out of state, they might be more enamored in some cases by A&T's really flashy greatest homecoming on earth, or or other schools, or Duke or NC State. So yeah. And did I fully answer your question? Was there an element of it that I should expand on?
Yeah, we're good. Yeah, Mike, they were mostly comments, but you elaborated. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. And are there any other questions that I can answer for anybody? Okay, well, thank you so much. Here I was thinking that I was worried about going over on time.
No, time looked really good.
All right, great.
Good, but really appreciate you volunteering your time and stepping up to the MFCA platform to take this on. And you are very well our second in our series of doing these PDW presentations. So thank you for stepping up, volunteering, and we hope to get this recording up on the website so everyone else who was unable to actually get it live can join and get that information. And anyone else is interested, please contact the MFCA, and we would love to feature you, your research, whatever ideas you want to share. And this time I'll hand it over to our VP, Carlos.
Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Tyechia, I'm so sorry I missed the meat of it, but from what I can tell, it sounds like it was pretty engaging and that, relevant, especially for these unique times. So I look back to going back to reviewing the recording after we've had a chance to look at it and edit it. We'll make sure it's available on our MFCA website for the rest of our members. Thank you all for taking the time out of your, I can only assume, busy Friday afternoon to support Dr. Paul and, just listen to all the good information that she had to share. It's always good to see all of your faces. I'm so disconnected. So, oh, and just because I'm a little corny, everybody, do that thing where you post your hand clap, your virtual hand clap for Tyechia.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate you allowing me to spend the afternoon with you. It's definitely been a pleasure.
All right, take care.
Awesome.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming.
Bye.
Bye.